Welcome back to our continuing and ongoing study in the Gospel of Matthew. We are going to be reading from Matthew chapter 27 and verses 5 and 6. I'm going to be reading from the New Living Translation. And all the people yelled back, "We take responsibility for his death, we and our children." So Pilate released Barabbas to them. He ordered Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip, then turned him over to the Roman soldiers to be crucified. Verse 25 is a verse that is misconstrued in the history of the church. It was never to be a permanent curse on the Jewish people. What is said here is, in a sense, one of those statements that people make without thinking. What am I saying? I'm saying overall, when you look at the crowd of people there, I don't doubt for a moment that probably the religious establishment, that is Caiaphas and his henchmen, had probably seated the crowd. They put people in the crowd that were designed to push the crowd towards an appropriate response. You put enough people there to kind of say what was wanted by Caiaphas and his henchmen, and then you get the crowd to follow. So in that sense, what I'm saying is when you look at this overall statement, there is a sense in which we need to see it as a point in place in which there is kind of an awkward silence and people just kind of blurt out something. In other words, I think you get some people in the crowd clearly pushing for this, no question about it. But I think for many others, it's just kind of like they're caught up in the moment and they just do it. And all of this, understand the crowd was being coached by the religious leaders. It was never meant to be seen or understood as an official proclamation by the Jewish people. In fact, when you look at this crowd, what is the most remarkable thing is that the vast majority of Jewish people were not even present on that day. And so when we talk about a crowd here, what do we mean? Maybe 100 people, maybe 50, who knows for sure. There is a second way to view what the people declared in verse 25 and see it as a prophetic pronouncement. And I think this is important, that sometimes there are statements made, and we see this in scripture at times, that become prophetic. They anticipate what will be. They are not prophecy in the formal sense of a prophet getting up there and saying, "Woe unto you unless you do this, because this will happen." But rather it is a statement with prophetic overtones. We are saying that these words had their terrible fulfillment in the Jewish rebellion of 66 to 70 of the Common Era. What Matthew is picking up and recording these words is that there's always a consensus when one rejects, a consequence when one rejects the overtures of God. The people in front of Pilate that day, in a callous and flippant way, were saying, in effect, bring it on. We can take responsibility for our choice. They did not grasp the magnitude of what they were speaking. You cannot reject God and his ways and not have repercussions. And we have to understand the tragedy of 66 to 70 of the Common Era, in large part, is a reflection of the fact that the Jewish people rejected God's plans. Now, we get into this murky whole issue of trying to reconstruct an alternative vision of history. What would have happened if the Jewish people had accepted Jesus? Would we have had the Jewish rebellion? I tend to think not. But I mean, obviously, what happened, and in part because people do not want the messiahship that Jesus brings, whether Jews or Gentiles. Pilate has finished his time of wavering. Verse 26 is one of the more horrendous verses of Scripture. It is horrendous because of its banality. It was just another day at the office. Now, this may not be what you do in your office, but for a Roman bureaucrat, in a sense, in a very real sense, this was just another day at the office. Remember that Pilate was part of the apparatus of a police state. He was, in that sense, judge, juror, and executioner. File the paperwork, and the wheels of executionary justice will happen. In this moment, we see the cold and unfeeling Roman bureaucrat doing what he was hired to do. Who knows, given the position he had, there probably was a social function to prepare for later in that day in the evening. He had other paperwork to do. I think overall, when we look at the trial of Jesus, and I think I kind of see this in films about the death of Jesus, where it I think inverts things in terms of priorities. Is when you look at movies of Jesus' death, what you often get is a real focus on Pilate and Pilate working through this issue. And kind of what I'm saying is it makes it look like on that day for Pilate, the big thing was the whole issue with Jesus, and that his attention that day was completely focused on Jesus and prosecuting the case and moving things forward. And I'm not really sure how accurate that is, how much of that is the consequences of us looking back at that and lifting one event out of his day and putting it, as it were, on a pedestal. How much was Pilate that day busy with all the ordinary things that come from being a bureaucrat, running a jurisdiction for the Roman Empire, within the Roman Empire for the Roman Emperor. And so when we look at this, how much of the fact was that for him, he was quite willing to get rid of and move on from the whole thing about Jesus so that he could get on to the other work that he had to do that day. Let us get it done and let us move on to what is next in the schedule. One more execution that will be buried in the endless bureaucratic statistics of empire. In a sense, I come to this point in Matthew 20. When I come to this point in Matthew chapter 27, I feel like I'm in the theater. The curtain has closed on the stage and the house lights come on. The first act in the drama is over. It is time for an audience break and for a resetting in the stage as it moves to its next setting. The first act is closed with just enough of a cliffhanger to have us want to come back and see what will happen in the second act. The focus will shift from Pilate and Caiaphas to Jesus, who has always been the center of the drama. You just get the sense that though the situation is bleak, the situation is not without hope. We will all have those moments when all is bleak and there seems to be no hope. Just remember that even if the first half of the drama closes on a dark note, the story is not finished. The first half of the drama is about Satan and his minions. The second half is about the Son of God and his resurrection from the dead.